Yes, hello, welcome back. I hope you had a refreshing 15 minutes. Let's move to our next section. So this is called Understanding Misogyny in Policing. We'll bring you our panel. We've got a very thorough panel for this, some real expert voices in this area as well. We'll come to that in a few minutes. But first, before we do, have a look at this. Some powerful stuff there. Let's meet our panel. We have Zoe Wakefield, Belinda Goodwin, Sam Hawkins is with us, Rachel Swan and Mark Travis. Good morning to you all. Already, before we even started, lots of questions from members coming through on this one, and you can get in touch in the usual way. So let's start things off. We're going to hand over to you firstly, Zoe, who's going to, I know you've got your own presentation here. We'll have a few more of those throughout the course of the next 45 minutes. But Zoe, morning.
Morning, Ian. Thank you. Thank you to everyone for joining our session. So our objective today is understanding, educate and challenge. We want to understand the meaning and the context of the term misogyny, to raise the profile of the problem and encourage conversations to take place akin to other hate issues, to educate officers on the use of terminology and language that can be interpreted as unprofessional, and to cultivate an environment where people feel empowered to challenge and say when things offend them. So, misogyny, what is it? Misogyny has existed throughout history. The term itself comes from the ancient Greek word misogynia, which was noted as a disease. The term misogyny can be found with several sacred texts of religions, mythologies, and Western and Eastern philosophy. Although this is most common in men, misogyny also exists and is practiced by women against other women or even themselves. Synonyms of the word include woman hater, anti-feminist, male chauvinist, male supremacist, chauvinistic and sexist. Misogyny can manifest itself in many different ways, in the forms of discrimination against women, belittling them in a conversation, seeking to control their behaviour, objectify them or be violent towards them. Their behaviour may be controlling, confident and self-centred, as well as competitive. Since the inception of the police force, it was many years until the very first women could join the organisation. That's just over 100 years ago now. Now we're in the 21st century and the demographics within policing have evolved, with far more inclusivity and women in the police service. Although there has been a lot of progress in the roles that females do, there is still an element of differing attitudes towards women within the organisation, not only from public perception, but from within the organisation itself, which is really sad. With this evolution has come a gradual change in attitudes. Fairness and inclusivity are now far better understood and acknowledged. However, there is still a conversation to be had about misogyny. We know that the majority of men and women that we work with are not misogynistic, but can we all, hands on our hearts, not had a point of view that could be teetering on misogyny, or not challenge misogynistic comments when heard, or even claim to know what misogyny is. Women in policing face unique challenges. The Federation and forces have introduced many policies and practices that have assisted in addressing this, such as flexible working, maternity support and buddies, menopause guidance and awareness, female-only bleep test and officer safety training sessions. However, many female officers have still experienced and still face misogynistic comments and behaviours, as these recent tweets show. Other examples we are aware of include being prevented from applying for promotion due to too much pregnancy-related sickness, being told that you're too fat to pass the fitness test after recently having a baby, being told you don't qualify for a bonus payment when pregnant because producing milk is not one of the competencies, being told there's no point in applying for firearms because you won't be strong enough to wear all the kit, being questioned about whether you're allowed to be single crewed. We chose to deliver our women's session today on this subject, with the objective being to get people to talk about it, to understand what it means within policing for all of us. This session is going to get the conversation started in order to educate and then to give us the confidence to challenge language and behaviour that we feel needs challenging, but to do this in the right way. With the rise of social media, and for all its good points, it now sits as a cesspool of hatred. Whenever a positive story is posted, there is always a negative comment that appears within the thread. Sadly, many of these negative comments are from serving or ex-police officers. There has quite rightly been a focus on raising awareness around unconscious bias due to race and ethnicity. Focus also now needs to be applied to gender. Many of the examples we hear are not intended to cause harm or upset, but they do, and that's where the education and awareness is needed. Enough is enough. The conversation starts here today, and this is going to be the first of many. We will work from a national perspective and with forces to focus on solutions. We are not naive enough to know that we will ever eradicate misogyny, but we have a duty to get this uncomfortable subject on the map. So it's no longer taboo, and to give everyone the confidence to know what it is in order to make a difference. Firstly, the executive members, myself, Belinda and Sam, will discuss our experiences of misogyny with policing. Then you'll hear from Chief Constable Rachel Swan from Derbyshire, who's the MPCC lead for gender in policing. And we've then got Assistant Chief Constable Mark Travis, who is working on sexual harassment policy. After that, there'll be the opportunity for Q&A with the panel. We really want you to get involved in this conversation to help shape it and guide us. So you can follow us on Twitter, you can contact us via email, and we really welcome your thoughts on today's session and the progression of this work. Thank you for listening.
And I guess just I suppose the obvious question, Zoe, that comes up, we've already had people getting in touch on this. That word banter, I was imagining you were expecting that to appear in this debate. It's just banter, we're just mucking around. There's obviously a massive distinction between, whether we're talking about industrial scale, or almost built within the system misogyny, or what a particular person says. I mean, what is your immediate answer when you hear people say, well, it's just, we were just messing around? Where does that sit today?
And I think a lot of people are genuinely just messing around. They don't intend to cause harm, but they don't think more deeply about the impact their words might be having on people. And this applies to everything, and the guide I always say to people is, would you have that conversation if the Chief Constable's in the room? And if you're taking the mickey out of somebody because they've brought their lunch in their child's Peppa Pig lunchbox, you'd probably happily have that conversation in front of the Chief, and that's proper banter. But if it's touching on those personal things, you wouldn't feel comfortable saying in front of the Chief, then maybe you shouldn't be saying it.
Yeah, nothing wrong with a Peppa Pig lunchbox, by the way. Use one for years. Let's just, respond to this, Rachel, if you could. We're going to hear more in detail from you, but just on that point of where we're at today to where we were, say, 10 years ago.
Okay, the banter one does come up all the time, particularly when you're talking about misogyny. And I do get that. And sometimes people will say, well, she doesn't mind us saying that. She joins in with it. And I think people say that to make themselves feel better and to make it's okay to do it. But secondly, I think they've not really explored whether that person does feel comfortable with that or not. And it isn't about not having fun. I mean, goodness knows we do a really tough job, and it's important on occasion to have a laugh where you can have a laugh. You know, really important in terms of de-stressing, but it shouldn't be at anybody's expense, and that's what we're saying. And I think we've made other forms of banter unacceptable. You know, we know racist banter is unacceptable, homophobic, but it would appear gender-related humour and banter is still okay. And we've got to shift that so that we put gender and feelings towards gender and inequality around that in the same place that we put other forms of that sort of banter, which is no longer acceptable. And we've got to move to that.
Yeah, I mean, Mark, on that point, I mean, where does it sit? I mean, as we just said there, there's not a cat and hell's chance anyone would accept racist banter or homophobic banter. That's not even a discussion anymore. But this one kind of sits in a slightly different place, which is rather curious.
Yeah, it does. When we look at some of the slides I'll bring up later on, and we hear from colleagues, it's not banter. People are feeling and experiencing some really hurtful comments that other people think are funny, but that are really cutting people to the core. And when you see those comments from surveys and how people feel about that, it really does make you stop and think. And I think we've got a role to play in terms of bringing that to the fore and to the front and helping people understand that actually it isn't acceptable. It's you know, some of the slides I'll talk about later maybe cover some of this, but they're relatively simple issues to address. It's complex because it's historic and it's part of our organisational structure, but to actually address some of those issues is really quite simple.
Yeah, and Belinda, it's a similar question really. I mean, is there a line there or is there no line at all on this one?
Thanks, Ian. It's a difficult one because it is where is that invisible line? What is acceptable? What's not acceptable? And just drawing on my own experiences, I joined as a police officer. I worked for the Met as a civilian, but I joined as a police officer in my late 30s. And having that exit interview with the borough commander at the time, it was don't try and keep up with the men. Didn't think too much of that. And then I think for all of us, we've all had kind of experiences of them sort of comments, but it's not something that you kind of take notice of too much at the time. But obviously me bringing it up now in 2021, it obviously resonated with me as probably, you know, a little bit inappropriate and a bit, well, why can't I keep up with the men? Another incident I can draw upon, Ian, is, you know, in a car chase, failed to stop. We get to that car. I'm the operator. I've got a male colleague driving the area car. I'm the first out of the vehicle. Got the car stopped, getting the suspect out of the vehicle also, who's not particularly, he's not struggling, or he's not, you know, I'm trying to detain him, doing quite a good job. When my male driver comes, barges me out of the way and takes control, or he said took control of the situation. Yeah. I felt I was taking control. It's not that I didn't want help, but I had that conversation with him afterwards because I was really curious at the time. You know, why did you do that? Well, I do that with whenever I'm with any of my female colleagues. You know, and is that him being? Was that him generally being? Well, I wanted to do that because you're a woman and I want to help you, or was that you? What I took from that is, am I good enough? Do you not think I'm as good as you at doing at being a police officer? I don't know, but it's great to get that conversation started from our end.
Yeah, I mean, if I was you, that would drive me nuts, frankly. I understand exactly what you're saying. Sam, on that point, I mean, it could be that the male colleague there was just, you know, simply had that wired into him, that he believed this was what you do as a bloke in terms of assisting a woman, and there was no malice in it. Might be misplaced, but that perhaps was his thinking. It's that thinking, Sam, that we've got to lose, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I have similar examples. A female colleague and I would be crewed together on a night shift car in a rural location, and we'd quite often be deployed and sent to jobs. And another patrol car would arrive or float around in the area that hadn't been dispatched to the call. And it transpired that exactly that, the male colleagues on our shift were coming from the right place, absolutely, but, felt the need that they had to come and see if, the girls were okay. Totally well-meaning, totally from the right place. And another example, I was quite young in service and in age when I was promoted to sergeant, and I went for my handshake and, sign off to get my stripes officially. And I remember having, standing in the line, and the senior officer coming, sort of shaking hands, said, "Oh, how lovely to see a young girl, as a sergeant. How old are you, my dear?" And, things like that, which, that was the only conversation he had along those lines with anybody else in the line, as I stood with my male colleagues. And again, well-meaning, but, for me, it kind of, I don't know, took the shine off my, getting my promotion that day, because I felt that I was being, patronised a little. And, as Rachel said, we all, the workplace would be a terrible place if we, couldn't have a joke with our colleagues. It's a tough job that we do. But it's just sort of, I don't know, getting the conversation out there, making people aware, things like that aren't automatically going to cause me offence if my colleagues are trying to look out for me. But it's just being aware and conscious that you're actually doing those things, I think.
Yeah. Let's go then to our next presentation. Rachel, over to you.
Thanks very much. Can we put the first slide up for me? Thank you. So what I'm actually going to talk about is violence against women and girls and the work that National Police Chiefs Council have been doing around this. It does bring in issues around misogyny, which we've talked about, but it also brings in, I think, the wider sort of inequality issues that exist in relation to violence against women and girls and the prevalence of it within our society. And then Mark's going to come on and talk about misogyny within the workplace. So next slide, please. Need to remember to do that. The tragic murder of Sarah Everard really brought into sharp focus the significant issues around violence, abuse, intimidation, harassment against women and girls, or those who identify as a woman and girl. And it is sadly very present within our society. It still exists. We know this in policing. This is not to say that any offences under RASO or domestic abuse, there aren't victims that are men. There are, but the vast majority are women and girls, and we know that, and so we know this. There is a lot of work in this area of business for policing. But following the tragic murder, the approach of policing and our partners, in terms of the prevention of violence against women and girls, and particularly the prosecution of offenders and how difficult that is, has brought significant criticism from various stakeholders and the public at large, with a lot of feeling from the public that women and girls don't feel safe in many public places. And violence against women and girls is now really being talked about very openly. And I feel like I've seen for the first time some real sort of energy and enthusiasm behind it to make some significant difference. And policing wants to play its part in that. So with Chief Constable Carl Folks from North Wales, we've been working together to put together a violence against women and girls strategy to try to do the cultural shift in terms of what policing does and how it deals with it, and also internally how we deal with it, to try to bring about wider societal change, which is out of our control. But as policing, we have a role to do within it. Next slide, please. So that strategy is to create an environment where women and girls feel safe to pursue their lives free from fear and harassment from men, delivering effectively upon policing's core responsibilities and using influence to support change within our communities and within policing. It's very much in a draft at the moment because we started writing it and there has been such a huge amount of interest and people wanting to contribute to it. And that includes internal voices within policing. As you've heard earlier, there's a lot of people with some real lived experience which want to contribute to this, to bring some change for the better. So we've paused revising the drafts, and actually what we're doing is going out and getting an awful lot of feedback on it, including from victims groups, for example, to try to make it the best that it can be. And some key principles within it are around violence, abuse and intimidation against women and girls in any form not being acceptable and not being tolerated. Public spaces, education establishments and online places should be seen as safe places for all, including women and girls. in particular in this. Women and girls should feel confident to report their experiences of harm to the police directly or even indirectly, and safe in the knowledge that they will be taken seriously and that they will be treated with dignity and respect. And that our actions to tackle that violence will be open to scrutiny and will be transparent. And we will listen to the lived experiences of women and girls, and their opinions will be heard. So, as I say, there's a lot of work to draw together that strategy. And within it are some of the areas that you would think. So safety in public place. You know, this is really common in terms of people's feelings of safety are very different to the likelihood of some harm coming to them in a public place. And so there are actions that can be done to make them feel safer. Criminal justice, there is an awful lot of work particularly under the RASO and the, rape and serious offences portfolio and the domestic abuse portfolio to try to improve criminal justice outcomes and also improve the experience of victims going through that, because it's a very combative process. Our own recording of crime and incidents, including misogyny, our own behaviour and how that can contribute towards how people think we will deal with them, which Mark will cover, and all of the engagement that we're doing. And one of the things that's really coming back strongly is the desire for us to put real emphasis on the offender or the perpetrator, so that it's not the victim who is seen as responsible for their own safety, but actually there's only one person who is the threat in that environment, and that's the perpetrator. So doing an awful lot more to change perpetrator behaviour rather than the responsibility being on the victim. Next slide, please. And move that one along as well, because I know we're short of time. Thank you. So I'm just going to talk briefly about recording gender hate or misogyny. For the sake of clarity, we're talking gender here includes biological sex and is sometimes referred to as misogyny, hatred against women, or misandry, hatred against men. And I'm always keen to emphasise gender hate can work against both sexes. So it isn't just against women, but clearly subject matter here is misogyny, and there is more of it as we know. So in 2020, the Law Commission made some proposals to reform the hate crime laws to remove the disparity in terms of the way that hate crime and law treats other protected characteristics, but it doesn't include gender. So it proposed that gender be added to those list of characteristics. We're expecting some recommendations later in the year, but subsequent to this, announced by Baroness Williams, there was an ask of all police forces to identify and record any crimes of violence against a person, including stalking and harassment, as well as sexual offences where the victim perceives it to have been motivated by hostility based on their sex. So it's not as wide as recording all gender hate incidents and crime, but it is recording if within that crime area there is an element of gender hate within that. So obviously we're just working through those requirements. At the same time, though, several forces, including my own, have gone ahead with recording misogyny or gender-based hate crime. And as the gender lead, I'm currently reviewing to see what difference that has made, what demands it's created, and look at some, if you like, lessons learned and best practice, so that we can, when the time comes that we roll that out nationally and the changes in the law take place, that we've got a good package and a good programme to move forward, so that people can have confidence in terms of how we deal with it, and also, we can make sure that we deal with it in a professional way. So. As I've said before, one factor in this is our own behaviour, and I know Mark is going to talk about that after me in terms of our behaviours within the workplace, and also how those then affect our behaviours towards the victims and witnesses, because a common thing that always comes back is that people didn't feel there was empathy, or they didn't feel that they were believed, and I think that fundamentally undermines people's confidence in terms of victims and their reporting. So I'll pause there. Because obviously Mark's going to carry on and cover misogyny within the workplace, but obviously happy to take any questions.
Okay, let me just bring in, I'm just aware that we are, of course, on the clock as well, so we'll hear from Mark in a second, but we've also got other questions more generally around this this issue that would be good to get in as well. So if I can throw in a couple of those, and then we can return to Mark's point, and then if any of you want to pick up on any aspects of anything somebody has said, then that's great. This comes in from Jane. He says, I've got 26 years service. I can honestly say that I'm very lucky that in my male colleagues, they've always been supportive. I've not really experienced behaviour behaviour that has been described today. But where I do feel misogyny is still alive and well is in the promotion process. What are the panel's thoughts on this, and how can the Federation negotiate and influence for our female colleagues going forward? Sam, let me put that to you first.
Yes, this is very much an issue, and it's something as secretary of my branch I have a lot of female officers come to me about. I was promoted as a part-time inspector 15 years ago now, and I think until last year no part-time female had been promoted to the rank of inspector as a part-time officer in the intervening 15 years until last year. So last year was the first time that we had a female part-time officer promoted to inspector. And yes, okay, there are less women that go for promotion, but you know that is a stark contrast, and it is difficult because particularly if you've got children and caring responsibilities, you know, there's this thing that policing is 24/7. You know, we need you to manage a shift. You need to be responsible. You can't work part time because you know your team won't see you on those days. And you know, we are making strides. We are getting there, but there are very much still. You know, when I was first promoted as an inspector, I was told you can't run a sector. You can't be a sector inspector because you're not full time. So, you know, the sort of roles I had were very limited and not very challenging for my personal development. So, yes, that is still very much an issue. And we are working hard to try and address it. But, I mean, I have 30 years service now and, you know, it's slow.
Yeah. Here's a question from Keith who says, with regards to misogyny, I think I'm right in saying it is now a protected characteristic when recording hate incidents and hate crimes. And yet our crime recording system, the Athena system, doesn't have this category. Why has this not been picked up? Doesn't the lack of characteristic on Athena show that we still aren't taking this issue seriously? Belinda, let me just put that to you to begin with. Again, it's whether the onus is the seriousness is actually on the actual allegations is a bit different, but we've all got different systems that we report on. I do think we are still catching up. I think we're in a state now where, like Rachel said, the conversation has really begun. It started around women's safety, and that's why the conversation around misogyny has started to take off. And we have to look at the crime recording. We have to really see whether it is fit for purpose and whether it does need reviewing. And we need to catch up with what we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. OK, we'll get some more questions in a few moments, but let's move to the third presentation on this one. It's over to you, Mark Travis. Morning, Mark.
Yeah, good morning. Thank you, Borodar all. So I lead on the sexual harassment work stream, and that's part of the misogyny plan, as Rachel's talked to. There's some things that have already been covered, so I might skip through some elements of the presentation just for the benefit of time and questions. So if we move to the next slide, please. You know, just wait for that to come in. So, into a bit of context here, I see policing as an incredible vocation of normal people who do incredible things, and the support that the Federation gives to colleagues and the support it gives to me as a PSD lead really is appreciated. So I come at this from a really positive perspective. But the next slide, if we can move on, does give us some really quite startling images. And I think Rachel made a point before about, well, you know, what do the public see? What do the public see when they deal with policing in terms of the way in which they have the confidence to report, they have the confidence to come forward and speak to us about their concerns, and particularly when we consider the issues around violence against women and girls. And you see some really hard headlines, a couple here, in terms of 1,500 accusations made against officers in terms of sexual abuse, sexual harassment claims, that you can see those concerns being manifest in the public and actually being picked up and being put forward as part of protest. And I think we have mixed messages that go out to the public. And I think some of those messages are about police officers being brave, engaging with communities, showing compassion, but at the same time being undermined by images in relation to sexual abuse and harassment in the workplace. And it was great to hear from a colleague who could have nothing but positive to say about colleagues that she's worked with, male colleagues that she's worked with, and that's fantastic. But if we can move to the next slide, please. What we've got here is some statistics, and these are taken from misconduct cases, and this is from 33 forces around the country. And I'll let people read these statistics for themselves. But what you have in here are a significant number of cases in volume and in terms of severity, where members of the public and police officers have experienced harassment, sexual assault, and being verbally abused from a sexual harassment perspective. And I think when you see a figure there near the bottom of that slide of 46% of the people in these 514 cases being pregnant, breastfeeding, subject to recent miscarriage or new mothers, it's quite stark and quite impactful in terms of some of the behaviour and some of the conduct that people have experienced. Now, that's in relation to misconduct. That's the most serious element that we're dealing with. One of the things we've done in Wales across the whole of the country was to run a survey, an independent survey across a large group of staff, and 90% of the female staff that were engaged with through that survey said that they had experienced some form of sexual harassment in the workplace. Some of that, I don't want to use the word low level because it's an inappropriate phrase, but not all of that was at the highest level. But a lot of it was the type of thing that undermines people's confidence, stops people coming forward for promotion, and prevents people moving into specialist roles. So if we can move to the next slide, please. I think the question is, well, what can we do about this? And the first thing that we've done is we've formed a national working group. That national working group supports Rachel's overall work area. But what are we asking people to do? Well, we're seeking to follow Rachel's comment before about responsibility, and we're seeking for people to become upstanders, not bystanders. We're seeking for colleagues to support their female colleagues when they hear inappropriate language and content, to challenge that in an appropriate manner. It doesn't have to be a high level of challenge. It can be supportive, it can be professional, and we want leaders to set the standards about what's acceptable on a shift, in a team. That line of banter we talked about before, leaders are really important in terms of determining what banter is. We're focusing on a voice and a choice. And what we mean by this is that the staff that we've surveyed tell us they don't want to go down a formal route. They don't want to go down a misconduct route. They don't want people to get into trouble. They just want the behaviour to stop. They just want to be able to come to work and work in an environment that is professional and that is ethical. And we're very clear in terms of the work we're doing nationally that we don't want to come at this from the point of view of enforcement. We want people to make good decisions and act appropriately because it's the right thing to do. I said before that many of the behaviours are simple to address, and I'm not making simple or light of this issue, but what colleagues are telling us is that they just want to be treated with respect, they want appropriate language, they want to be treated with a good attitude, and they want professionalism in the workplace. And if we sum that up as a code of ethics, we want police officers to respond to the code of ethics, which most people do. Actually, in terms of framing what is acceptable or what isn't, it's framing where banter sits or it doesn't sit. If you work to the code of ethics, it's hard to go wrong. I actually am a PSD lead in the force, and I see many sad consequences of people having life-changing consequences from their conduct. And what I'm encouraging people to do is to challenge conduct to prevent misconduct. Nobody wants to be in a situation having to be formally supported by the Federation as a consequence of their behaviour. And what we want to do is nip behaviour in the bud at the earliest opportunity, help people to understand where they're acting inappropriately, to prevent us getting to the point where people have to face misconduct processes. So we're working really hard to provide a balanced policy, procedures, marketing and training tools and campaigns that we'll be looking to use later this year to try and highlight to people what good looks like and to try and keep a proportionate response to try and resolve some of these issues. Next slide, please. Just a thank you, really. Many people are already working really hard in this area and doing everything they should be doing. And I think if we all put our mind to it and all put our shoulder to it, we can actually improve this significantly. So thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
It's interesting, Mark. Thank you. It's interesting. You talked about appropriate language and what is acceptable. We had a question from Lisa, who said that in the opening video yesterday for the conference, Boris Johnson talked about getting the police the manpower we needed. How on earth can we address this issue when the message we get from the top starts with this? Now, I know to some people they'll say, hang on, are we really going to go there? Do we need to change? Is Mother Nature wrong? Is that sex? All of those kind of arguments. But is there some, I mean, Lisa has raised this question sincerely. I mean, Rachel, to begin with, do words like that matter? Does that feed into this debate? Is Boris Johnson part of the problem, Rachel?
I'm not going to answer that latter bit. However, I'd probably, there is something about, and I was saying this before we came on in terms of talking about this, and not only do I think it's really important for me to talk about it. I think it's my responsibility to talk about it. Role modelling is really important because whilst that phrase in itself might not have mattered to many people, it will have really mattered to some, and that's really the point. And actually, that's the Prime Minister talking. So that's role modelling, at a very high level.
But how do you legislate on that point? I mean, because it is difficult, because you're right. I mean, it might not matter to, 98% of people, but there's 2% where it will matter. Do we change language? Do we re-educate based on that 2%? How does that work? Because it's a tricky line to...
It is really tricky. And what you don't want is that you become... this isn't about being the politically correct police, which we often get criticised about, and this isn't that, because people slip up, and it's not about, Mark's work is not about picking on people because they use the wrong phrase, every now and then. It's actually about wider attitudes and behaviour, not just a one-off bit of language, and we need to be proportionate in all of that, because otherwise people will alienate people within the workplace and they'll be afraid to speak. And I don't think anybody here is saying that, but there is something about thinking about the impact of what you're saying and how you're saying it.
OK, here's a question that came in from Charlotte. I think it's great that we're looking into the wider issues of misogyny in society, but I thought the session was about misogyny in policing. Sure, the change should start from within. I'll come back to that in a second. And Catherine, I feel that some of the lack of access to career options has a lot to do with flexible working and agile working opportunities. Sam, let me bring you in on that point. Flexible working, I mean, that's a huge issue that really does feed into this wider debate.
Yeah, absolutely it does. It really does. And as I said, every time we have a promotion process, the people that usually come to my door for some support and guidance from a federation point of view are quite often the officers in those situations. And, it can be, our male colleagues have the same issues if they, have got a flexibility and require a flex in their working pattern as well. But, predominantly it is women. And I think as well, because of the culture of, misogyny, it's there, isn't it? It's unconsciously it's there, and I think as women sometimes as well we kind of limit ourselves. We're not going to be as much to sort of put ourselves in the frame, and it is really difficult. But it's really difficult to get yourself credible and relevant, and to tick the boxes on a promotion process when the people looking at those processes, are going to be working full time and across all roles. And, you might not have had that opportunity because you have been working flexibly. And we really need to, and I'm, a big advocate of this, we really need to look at how we can maximise what our flexible workers can give us. Let's look more creatively at the roles. Let's not think, OK, well, you can't work 24 hours. You can't work nights at the moment because you have a young baby and you're a single parent. OK, let's put you in, this office job somewhere. There are roles, these officers that work flexibly have the same skills and abilities. I mean, I was a full-time sergeant when I had my first child, and when I then came back part-time, the change in attitude and treatment towards me was quite stark. And I remember sort of shaking my head and thinking, nothing has changed. I am still the same person, still have the same skills to offer this organisation. The only thing that has changed is that I'm not working full-time now. So, that we are really keen to try, and it's a culture takes a long time to turn around. We are making some changes, but we do still have a long way to go.
Yeah, I was talking to somebody recently who was saying that when she needed to kind of alter her working hours because of childcare, that there was always somebody in the room where she felt there was a bit of a tut. And when a male colleague had precisely the same issue, there was almost kind of a smile of admiration. Good lad, he's doing his thing, what a modern chap he is. And I suppose, Belinda, just on that point, it's those little nuances, which aren't so little to the individual, that need to be ironed out, right?
Absolutely, you're right. And even we really battled with this session, and I'll be honest, with everyone as women's session and bringing, it was a conversation that we all had within ourselves about, how we're going to frame it. We have to do it sensitively, and it's right what Rachel said and what we're all saying. This isn't about all men, and we see that hashtag, not all men. We know that, and it's women as well. I've had it from other women, but it is when we mention this session, we have had eye rolls. It's you're talking about that. It's kind of like whenever we talk about female-only issues, you still get the eye rolls. You still get that. Oh, not that then, and it's trying to get that barrier down, and so we stopped getting the eye rolls and we stopped getting that attitude.
Yeah.
It is a culture change, like Sam says. It's a massive culture change, but it starts when you're young. When you're young, that attitude towards women, and again, what Rachel says, it all feeds into women's safety. A lot of us have all got experiences and examples of when we've maybe felt unsafe. Why is that? How is that acceptable? Just because I'm a female, walking my dog at 10 o'clock at night and worrying about safety, as opposed to what men would worry about at that time of night. So it's important to talk about it.
Let's. We've only got a few minutes left, so let's just go across the whole panel. And if you could tell us, kind of, just give us a sort of brief overview as you think what needs to happen next. If I put the question like that, what's the first thing that needs to happen to take this to the next step? I think you've all acknowledged there's been incredible progress, but it is work in progress, so still clearly not good enough. But what fundamentally needs to happen next? Zoe, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think the main thing for me is education. Sue, who unfortunately the other executive member of our group can't be here today because she's working on nights at G7, but she asked her team, what is misogyny? And they said, oh, isn't that when you're married to more than one person? So we really need to educate officers and staff around actually what is misogyny, and what is the right thing to say and what isn't. And Rachel wasn't happy to comment, but I'll comment on what Boris said. It was wrong. He never should have used the word manpower. Somebody surely checks what he says before he says it, and obviously whoever checked it clearly didn't think there was anything wrong with using that word either, when there are plenty of other words he could have used and said instead, which aren't gender specific. And I've been chair of my local branch board now for less than a year. The number of times I've been referred to as a chairman, and it. And it's not hurtful, but it's annoying because actually, don't people respect the fact that I'm a female and I've done well to get to this position?
It's just inaccurate, right? I mean, it's as simple as that.
Yeah, it's I wouldn't call them a chair lady. So for me, education is the main thing.
Sure, Mark, let's put that to you. What needs to happen next?
Yeah, I'd like to go to the promotion issue, and I think that we need to, as leaders, be far more encouraging, far more supportive. We need to smash the glass ceiling as opposed to kind of remove the glass ceiling, and make it encourage people to come forward. We just run a superintendent's board. We're not a single female applicant. That's tragic, and I think we need to look really hard at our selection processes, the way in which we support people, the way in which we mentor and coach people, and to really reach down into the organisation and pull people through because they've got the right talent. I'm not talking about compromising standards. Pull the people through the right talent and make sure that we represent the organisations and the communities that we serve. Okay,
I know we're short on time, but Rachel, what needs to happen next?
I think there's a few things. I think there is actually acknowledging that it still exists, even though it's 2021, acknowledging that this still exists is a starting place. And it may not be the overt sexist behaviours that we've had previously at all, and I'm not saying that, but acknowledge that there's still signs and symbols that are within it, and the impact that then can have on people is a good starting position. Simple things, people will say, oh, that's the female chief. But they wouldn't say that's the male chief. It's just things like that, which just add to really that there is some sort of difference that makes it seem in some way less when it isn't at all. And But in all of this, I do want to say, I know I've got the gender portfolio, and it's really just an emphasis to remind people that I make great pains to say this isn't just about issues related to women in that portfolio. I look at issues related to men as well, and I just want to really make that clear to people so that people don't think, well, it's just female chief going on about issues that affect women. That's not it at all.
Okay. Rachel, thank you. Sam, same question to you. What needs to happen next?
I think we need to look at ourselves and do more work in the forces as well on our unconscious biases. So we know, as Zoe said, it's not about, bashing and our male colleagues being, terrified to say anything or say the wrong thing. But I think actually, let's all have a look. Let's think about we all have them. We all have biases. If we're aware of them, and then how we interact with our colleagues and things, then that's a good place to start.
Belinda, final question to you for final response from you.
Thank you, Ian. All of the above and challenge. Let's start challenging. But I love what Mark said, but doing it in the right way, doing it in a sensible way. We're not out. We're Fed reps at the end of the day. We want to look after our members and educate and help, So, but just start challenging, just saying, get people to think about their language. So thank you, Ian.
Not at all. Listen, thank you, everybody. What a fascinating panel. I think a lot of people would have come into that thinking, as a couple of you alluded to, is this really, do we need to know this stuff? Is this of interest? And I think anyone that just listened for the last 45 minutes would have found themselves having a fairly swift education in the nicest possible way. So thank you to our panel on that one. I'm sure that conversation will continue, and we'll be back here again discussing maybe the next evolution of this area. We are going to take a short pause now for some lunch, but some cracking sessions coming up on the other side of the lunch break, including policing protests as well. There's an awful lot, as you would imagine, to be said over the last 12 months. This has really kind of hit the headlines and become an absolutely massive story and been incredibly troublesome for some areas of policing. So we'll tuck into that in the next section. And police recruitment as well during a pandemic. What does it mean if you've suddenly joined the police service and day one you're out on the streets and there's no one there? What an interesting baptism of fire that was. All the implications involved as well. Don't forget, of course, during the break, go to the virtual exhibition as well. You can find your way there through the usual channels. That's all up and running. Questions for the next section as well, all online. We've got about an hour before we're back here for the next section, so we'll return for the next debate at 12:45. Enjoy the lunch and we'll see you then.